Looks good. Everyone can see that. Natalie, that looks good. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks everyone so much for being here. And thanks to the Rupert's Land Center for the invitation, of course, and to Amanda Evans and Natalie for organizing. I'm Justin. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Alberta Augustana campus. So that is our rural campus in Camrose. That's where I am right now. I'm also a Red River Métis with lineage to Gladue and La Jamelière, and my dad is a child of the 60 Scoop, which informs the work that I do. Writing on Indigenous experiences with incarceration and reentry is, as we'll see shortly, the foster system is important to today's talk. So a few things before I jump in. My co-presenter, I was supposed to present with Dr. Sandra Bucerius, who is our project lead, but she couldn't be here today, so I will be flying solo, but that's fine. Just on going back to the original slide, I have Dr. Philip Badawi also listed on the slide here. He helped me put together some of the data for this talk, so I wanted to thank him as the top at the top as well. And in short, I am representing today a pretty large research group made up of professors and students from different backgrounds and expertise. And as you'll see, this is a very large and complex project, and it's also in progress. So we aren't done yet, and many of the things I say will be preliminary, and things can change. But whatever the case, I'll try my best to answer any questions people have. So this is what I'll cover during this talk. I'll start with who we are and what we've been up to for the last 8 or 9 years or so. And then I'll talk about a major finding from our original study called Prison as Refuge, which is related to the remand prison situation in this province and country. If you're not sure what I mean, I'll explain that shortly. And why our older research matters is because this finding, among others, informed how we developed this new study looking at people's experiences with reentry from prison, which is the core of today. And so for most of this talk, I'll be covering some, again, preliminary findings on our Métis participants as well as broader Indigenous issues. And the last few things here, I'll discuss what we're doing in the near future with a proposed healing and integration center. And then at the end, of course, we'll do questions and I'll pass it off to our other awesome speaker, Sharon. So who are we? What do we do? We're led by Dr. Sandra Bucerius and part of the University of Alberta Prison Project, or UAPP. And this slide is a summary of what we've been up to since roughly 2016. Everything that I talk about today falls under this broader project. What is the Prison Project? In a nutshell, we want to learn about the experiences of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system. And we're also interested in the experiences of people who work in that system. And ultimately, we want to use what we learn to make evidence-based changes that support system-involved people. So how do we learn things? Well, in short, we go out into the world and we interview those people. And as you'll see, we have more kind of survey style questions that we ask them. And other times, the questions are more open-ended and we just encourage people to talk about their experiences, kind of whatever they think is important with ethnographic and qualitative questions. So under the UAPP, we have so far conducted 3 large studies on incarceration in Canada. The first one is our original study where we interviewed almost 800 incarcerated people and 200 staff across 4 provincial prisons and 2 federal prisons in Western Canada. With that project, roughly 40% of our participants identified as Indigenous, 40, which reflects the broader statistics on mass incarceration of Indigenous peoples in this country. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Then the pandemic happened, and for obvious reasons, we could not continue our original study. We couldn't go inside of prisons. So instead, we did research involving the loved ones of incarcerated men during the COVID-19 pandemic, exploring kind of family experiences, mental health, that kind of thing. I'm not really going to talk about that study today. I'm going to be focusing more on the first and last ones. And finally, we have our current reentry study on reentry experiences, which is easily the largest and most complicated of the 3. Now that we're much more experienced with this work, having done this for almost 10 years now, we can make these studies a little bigger, more complicated. And this will be the focus of today. However, before we keep going and talking about the study, I do have to provide some context on kind of how we got here with the topics we're focusing on, and of course, contextualize Indigenous issues broadly. I'm assuming most people watching here today are familiar with these disturbing statistics. In Canada, roughly 5% of the population is Indigenous, yet Indigenous peoples make up 30% of prison admissions broadly. And this rate has increased 43% over the last decade. The situation is even worse for Indigenous women, where they now make up half of federal prison admissions for women. And as I have on the slide here, these disparities are even higher in the prairie provinces where we did our research, with Indigenous peoples making upwards of 40 to 75% of the population, depending on the prison. Why are Indigenous people so vastly overrepresented? Again, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you probably already know Canada has a long history of colonial policies designed to destroy Indigenous cultures, which today we call cultural genocide. And there are many overtly racist policies we can point to, such as the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s Scoop, to name a few. And those policies and others have, in short, devastated Indigenous nations and communities and families. Indigenous peoples are more likely to be living in harsher or impoverished conditions, suffering from mental health struggles or intergenerational trauma, things that can sometimes lead to criminalized behaviors or involvement with the underground economy or substance use or gangs. So I could go on here, but I'm assuming, again, people watching are familiar with how colonialism explains the massive disparities you see here. And as many have argued, the Canadian prison is an extension of this ongoing colonial history. But Indigenous peoples are not powerless. There is resistance everywhere to Canada's justice system, or the colonial justice system, with various nations and organizations trying to return power to Indigenous peoples, power over justice and healing in particular. And this resistance, for example, is reflected in the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and other major Indigenous-led reports. As you might know, there are 94 calls to action as part of the TRC, and so part of the work that we do is attempting to address some of these calls to the best of our ability. Regarding our 2016 study, one of the big things we collected data on was our participants' experiences with victimization. So showing, perhaps unsurprisingly, our incarcerated Indigenous people experience dramatically higher levels of violent victimization compared to the general population. So we do attempt to collect data as part of calls 39 and 40. For call 36, I've published a few papers on people's experiences with cultural or indigenized programming in prisons, which, while often flawed, our participants tend to find invaluable. And relatedly, call 35, I'm starting a study alongside Dr. William Schultz at MacEwan on healing lodges, and we've been in touch with two Section 81 healing lodges that have, for the first time, allowed independent researchers to interview folks inside. And so all of this together falls under, of course, calls 30 and 31. I see a big part of our project's goal is contributing to both of these calls by learning about people's experiences. We are trying to eliminate the mass incarceration of Indigenous peoples, and a big part of this is empowering nations and groups to regain control over justice systems and develop alternatives to incarceration that help people heal, which we'll talk more about at the end. So I try to approach our research with those goals in mind, and the TRC isn't the only Indigenous-led report. Of course, there are others as well. But moving on to our original 2016 study, this is a summary of what I already said. We interviewed 800 people, roughly 40% identified as Indigenous. One-third of our participants either lived on reserves, went through the foster system. About a quarter either attended residential schools or had family members who did. And the other thing to mention is that when we started this 2016 study, it was very exploratory. At the time, it was very rare for independent researchers to interview people inside of Canadian prison. And because of this, we frankly didn't know much about what happens inside of these places. So we asked people about everything. We let our participants basically lead those conversations. So since doing this work, we've had all sorts of findings on, for example, the fentanyl and toxic drug crisis impacting people inside and how maybe that affects like gang politics. We've published on staff relations, prison programs. And in short, as I mentioned, why I'm bringing this up is because a lot of what we learned from that first study influenced how we designed the new study, the reentry one, especially this finding, which I want to spend some time on. From our 2016 study, one of the most tragic findings of our work in prisons over the last 8 or 9 years or so is that many of the most marginalized people in our sample, who are typically Indigenous, oftentimes women, expressed that prison was a place of refuge from their life outside or on the streets. In other words, their life on the streets was so challenging or dangerous that they used the prison as, perhaps ironically, a social service provider. which for us, maybe those of you listening, prison is probably the last place we would think of to get help. But for our participants, many of them are living under extreme circumstances. So, for example, for them, prison was a place where they could potentially sleep relatively safely for the first time in a long time, because as they told us, homeless shelters are not necessarily safe, particularly for women. People also used prison to escape the cold. As I'm sure we all know, the prairies get as cold as -40 every year, sometimes -50. And when that happens, frankly, people die in the streets. Prison served as a place where some participants could escape their abusive partners. For others in prison, they could get meals on a regular basis, or they could try and get clean from the potentially lethal or toxic drugs they were using on the streets. Um, Prison served as a place where some participants could escape or sorry, I already said this one. Others found that the medical and dental attention in the prison was more accessible for them than on the outside. And to be clear, prison healthcare is really bad, but for some of these people, they cannot access healthcare on the outside or certain types, especially dental. For other people, they didn't have to worry about where they would sleep at night or what their next meal would be. And so they were finally mentally prepared to attend to their medical needs. And to be clear, to be crystal clear, this is not us saying that prison is a good place to be. Rather, what this speaks to is how institutions across society, such as schools, child services, shelters, medical and counseling services, the courts, and of course, governments have so dramatically failed these people. A social worker I was talking to the other day called prison, quote, the last stop. The last stop. In other words, if people don't get help with mental health or aggression or drug use or no economic or employment or housing support, the prison is where they may end up, the last stop. And all of this shows, I think, that responding to mass incarceration and the TRC calls to action also requires addressing bigger social problems beyond the prison. And maybe that's obvious to some of us listening, but for our findings validate what many practitioners have expressed to us, that addressing these issues requires a much broader, systematic response beyond just the prison. And so again, a lot of these findings from our original study informed our newest work on reentry and the kinds of questions we're asking, as you'll see. So on to this new work, which is I'll be talking about for the rest of the time. What do we know about community reentry from prison? So let's start with what do we know about this topic? Based on existing research, we know that reentry is rife with challenges, of course. However, most studies on this topic are conducted in the USA. Most famously is probably Bruce Western's reentry study in Boston or the Boston area. And we tried to match somewhat how Western designed that study, a little bit anyway. But perhaps obviously, Alberta is not Boston. There are unique contextual factors that I want to touch on quickly. The first I already mentioned, people are often reentering communities during our severe and sometimes lethal winters, making survival on the streets extremely challenging. Another factor is that Indigenous peoples make up a significant portion of our sample, and I'll show you some stats in a second. And for many First Nations and Métis people who leave prison, they are returning to oftentimes remote reserve communities or Métis settlements, which of course is a different experience than reintegrating in somewhere like downtown Boston, for example. The last important contextual thing, and then I'll explain the study and what you're seeing on the slide. Most reentry studies center on people released from prison after an extended period of incarceration. In other words, people released after long sentences. This is not how most people experience incarceration in Canada. In Canada, most incarcerated people serve a series of short sentences. I'll say that again. Most incarcerated people in Canada serve a series of short sentences, often at remand institutions or remand centers. And this is important to emphasize. What is a remand center? If you're not sure what that is, remand means you are incarcerated and awaiting your trial or sentencing. In other words, you are still presumed innocent, you have not been sentenced yet, and you are being held in detention in a remand prison while awaiting that decision or court. So what you see on the slide, for example, the picture, that is the Edmonton Remand Center. That is the biggest prison in Canada. So why does this matter? Why am I emphasizing remand prisons? Well, this is how the majority of people experience incarceration across Canada. For example, in Alberta, in 2023, 77% of the prison population was remanded. 77% of the prison population was remanded. So this is the most common experience. Also important to mention, remand institutions are typically harsher than other prisons. because people are not there as long. The government apparently is less interested in rehabilitation. So in remand facilities, there's typically less programming and less access to resources. There's also overcrowding problems, where three people will be living together in a tiny cell. So harsher conditions overall. With remand, people spend several weeks or months there, but for others, they can be remanded for multiple years depending on the severity and complexity of their case. So, in short, the context of our study is unique, and currently, there are no systematic, large-scale Canadian studies on reentry to help us understand people's experiences after prison. For example, like what barriers do people face? What supports do people need? How do these people define successful reintegration? What does successful reintegration mean for them? Last thing for context, getting into our study. Most works on reentry, at least in Canada, have been small convenience-based samples. And so for our project, we're doing a large randomized sample using mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods. And you might say, what does that mean? Why does that matter? What makes this unique is that we can look at population differences. So for example, how reentry experiences differ between men and women, how it differs between low income versus middle or working class income versus unhoused. We can also look at racialized differences, Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, and also we can parse out, which is what I'm doing this talk today, Métis experiences and First Nations experiences, which I'll show you soon. With a sample this big, we can do these kinds of comparisons, which is useful and also rare. So we are interviewing 30, as you see on the slide. I have 33, but it's actually 35% of the currently incarcerated population in all 8 provincial prisons in Alberta. This means that our final data set will be about 1,250 people. And this amount is significant to the extent that we hope it will influence policy decisions in Alberta and beyond. And we're actually just about to complete data collection. I don't know if it's this week or next week. It's very soon. So we have achieved basically our sample of 1,250 people. So we're very happy about that. So how does this study work? Generally speaking, we are surveying a randomized sample of folks being released on any given day, literally before they leave the prison doors. We interview them if they have time. So you can see the types of themes that we ask about or tap into on the slide here. Once they're released, we follow up with them 14 days post-release, asking questions around, how do they spend their first few days, ask about their social networks and relationships, substance use, and ask again about various access to domains such as healthcare, housing, etc. Altogether, we have 4 additional waves. And so what is the point of the waves? In short, this allows us to capture the first year post-release. In other words, what are people's lives like over the course of a year that they've been released from prison? And a few other details, we do compensate participants for their time, and we can also check with them if they get reincarcerated. So if they go back to prison. And I'll talk more about reincarceration in a second. And so finally, kind of moving into our findings here. Looking at the initial data, again, this is preliminary, early numbers, but something that is immediately striking, but also tragically unsurprising, is that Indigenous peoples in our randomized wave 1 sample are so massively overrepresented. You can only speak about this in terms of mass incarceration. Indigenous peoples make up about 6.8% of the general population in Alberta, yet account for 60% of our samples, 60 of our interviewees. So these findings, they never cease to amaze me despite spending so much time with this topic. And just a reminder, as I go through these data, the numbers might change by the time we complete the study and analyze the entire data set. So this, again, is all preliminary. So the next few slides are based on analyzing 474 participants. Again, this isn't the whole sample of 1,250. For this talk, we were able to analyze data for not quite half of recruited participants, but a decent amount. So you can stay tuned for future presentations by us when we complete this work. But this is what we're looking at today. Of the 474 participants, we have 185 non-Indigenous participants, 75 Métis participants, and 214 First Nations participants. So with our data set, we can break this down and do some comparisons. And so I'll start by talking about Indigenous peoples broadly, and then talk about Métis issues specifically. First, some general but notable findings on racial disparities related to recidivism. recidivism, meaning broadly returning to the criminal justice system, such as rearrest, reconviction, reincarceration. Our Indigenous participants had slightly higher lifetime arrest rates, having been arrested 24 times in their lives in comparison to 20 times for our white participants, and they have been incarcerated on average 19 times compared to 13 times for our white participants. And last, the onset of the first incarceration for Indigenous peoples is on average 2 years younger. So Indigenous peoples are overall incarcerated at younger ages. Again, these are early numbers. We don't know whether these discrepancies will hold and become large enough to become statistically significant with our final sample. And going to the right side of the slide, there are three major themes becoming prominent in these initial participant responses overall. These are strong optimism, but failed supports. Second one is system-produced recidivism, and I'll explain what that means shortly. And finally, choosing prison as the better option for things like, healthcare and other resources or services, which can be related to prison as refuge. So I'll cover these things and then parse out Indigenous and then specifically Métis differences. So let's first talk about how our participants leave prison. After building some rapport, we ask in the interview, we ask our participants, how likely is it you think that you'll return to prison in the next 12 months? Extremely likely, very likely, slightly likely, not likely at all. And our sample is overall extremely optimistic that they will successfully re-enter society and not return to prison, at least not within the next 12 months. However, this is not on the slide. However, of the 514 participants from one of the remand prisons we studied, we know that already more than 167 have returned to prison. So that's about 33%. I think actually our most recent number for the whole study is 35% of our participants have been reincarcerated. And several of our participants have been back multiple times already. So again, there's strong optimism, but failed supports. But I can elaborate on this failed supports element. So what is happening here? With failed supports, there are many issues that people express, but because of time, I'll focus on the most prominent one expressed by our participants. We ask everybody, what is your biggest challenge upon release? And as you can see on the slide, the answer that is most likely to be picked is staying clean and sober. The majority of our participants make changes to substance use in the prison. Both of our large studies suggest that many people see prison as a place where they can stay away from substances and sober up. However, I do want to be crystal clear here. This is very different from forced treatment. It's very different from forced treatment. Why I'm bringing this up is because the conservatives, for example, are proposing forced rehabilitation, which basically means locking up drug users to get them sober, which the evidence suggests doesn't work or rehabilitate. What I'm describing is not the same thing as forced treatment, because if they wanted to, our participants can get drugs inside the prison. They can. It's quite easy to get drugs in most institutions. Anyone working in the system will tell you this. And for whatever personal reason our participants have, they tell us that prison is a place that they choose to sober up. Choice is key there. Forced rehabilitation is not a choice. And proposing that is, I would argue, anti-science. The other part of this, though, in the survey, participants express that upon release, they want to, quote, avoid slipping back to their old patterns. However, all of these people leave prison, or almost all, leave prison without having a treatment plan in place, even if it's an informal plan. In short, by not having a continuation of care between prison and the community, some of our participants fall back into their old using habits, which unfortunately then often leads to new charges or new breaches. So again, these are early findings, but to paint a picture, what we're seeing so far is a clear pattern where our participants are willing and motivated to stay sober and change their lifestyles upon release. They want to do this, they express this to us, but then they're released into the community without any resources or services to support them in this path. And so on to, relatedly, some Métis numbers. When it comes to leaving prison without supports, these are currently our most notable preliminary findings on Métis people. As I have on the slide here, our early numbers suggest that Métis and First Nations experiences with reentry from prison do not differ significantly overall. However, there are a few notable disparities concerning housing and employment. With this early sample, Métis participants were the most likely to say they do not have housing and employment in place upon release. In other words, they're being released with no job to go to and or no place to live. As I have on the slide here, 74% of Métis respondents said they do not have employment in place upon release. 32% of Métis respondents said they do not have housing in place upon release. And this is quite striking. And the question, of course, is why is this happening? Why is it that Métis people appear to struggle the most in these areas? Frankly, I don't know. This is still too early to say. Once we finish the study, we can look at the completed data set and come up with some theories. But one broad explanation that might explain this, some of this, not just for Métis people, but the sample more broadly, is the second major theme here. We're calling this system-induced recidivism. And we're not the first ones to make this argument. Recently, for example, Western and Harding published a paper arguing that studying, quote, career criminalization, so this refers to people who have continuous contact with the system throughout their lives. They argue that research and reports on recidivism is too focused on the individual and actually needs to focus more on how the criminal justice system itself sustains police contact and incarceration over the life course. To put it another way, they argue that a significant component of what we call recidivism is in fact system produced. And so we think this is a strong argument that we are seeing reflected in our data. And if you're not sure kind of what I'm saying, I have some examples. So for example, I want to talk about Maurice for a moment. Maurice is a 41-year-old Métis man. He told us he was arrested, quote, too many times to count, and his longest time on the outside after turning 18 was 3.5 months, a 3.5 month stretch. In other words, after turning 18, the longest time Maurice had ever been out of prison was just over 3 months. And he called our team a few weeks ago and he let us know that he's going back to remand. Why is he going back to remand? He had been released into Edmonton, but was supposed to attend court in Grand Prairie 2 days later. So if you're not sure, that's a 5-hour trip north. The thing is, he was released from prison. He had no money and no ID, no identification. And for these reasons, he was unable to secure a bus ticket to Grand Prairie within those 2 days, and he could not attend court. So as a consequence, he now had a new warrant. And he said he was going to turn himself in. So we asked him, why are you considering turning yourself in? And this is his reply on the slide. We asked him, whether a shelter might be an alternative to turning himself in. And he said, no fucking way. I just want to close my door and not watch my back for a while. I'm tired. And Maurice isn't unique. Many of our participants face warrants or get breached for conditions they cannot keep in the first place. So for example, Kayla is a Métis woman. She lives a transient lifestyle, so she's sleeping on the streets, shelters, garages. When she's lucky, she'll stay at a friend's place that she just met. Many people in our sample live in similar circumstances and have the condition of curfew. The condition of curfew. So basically, you have to be inside after a certain time. Obviously, if you do not have stable housing, you cannot possibly comply with this condition. So some people will breach for not being at home. So when Kayla told us about her conditions, her release conditions, she laughed and she said, so basically I'll be back here right away. I'll get breached for not being, quote, at home. How the fuck does that make sense when you're homeless? Others have to report to their probation officer or bail supervisor on a regular basis, and that's often challenging when people do not have cell phones. So our participant, Damien, he's another Métis man, talked about that, and you can read it on the slide. And perhaps obviously this affects the most marginalized or impoverished people the most, who are disproportionately Indigenous. So back to the original point, what we're showing here are examples of system-produced criminal justice contact, people leaving the prison with difficult and sometimes impossible release conditions. However, this argument alone cannot explain why people like Damien state that it's, quote, a good option to have when looking at the possibility of going back to prison. So this leads us to the third major point that we need to consider. Looking at our data, to understand why participants sometimes express that prison may be a good option at times, we need to, of course, consider their life circumstances outside of the prison and their contact with institutions other than criminal justice institutions. So to put it another way, we need to start foregrounding how people move through various institutions, with prison being only one of the various consequential spaces that shape their lives and experiences. And this actually seems especially important when thinking about the mass incarceration of Indigenous people. So, for example, our Indigenous participants were far more likely to have experienced various carceral institutions long before their first prison sentence, and often characterize themselves as having been, quote, institutionalized before arriving at prison. So this happens in various ways, but to focus on the most significant finding or disparity, we pulled data on who raised our participants. And as you can see, and is perhaps unsurprising considering the colonial history, Indigenous respondents were much more likely to be raised in foster homes in comparison to others. This difference is statistically significant. Some of our older participants also expressed that they survived the residential school system. Other participants were, like my dad, impacted by the 60s scoop. So while not all Indigenous participants were residential school survivors or had been placed in foster homes, they almost always tell us that they have close family members who were affected by these policies. And this reality seems to contribute to this incredibly complicated personal assessment where tragically for some participants they see prison as preferable to some institutions where they have had previous contact. So for example, when we asked Maurice why shelters weren't an option, he told us that shelters remind him of the group homes he grew up in without the opportunity to close a door, even if it's just the door to his cell. So based on traumatic experiences he had. So this type of situation or personal history points to the need for us to better consider a person's experience with the justice system in the context of their wider institutional biography and adaptation, how they've adapted to other forms of institutionalization. Yes, we need to obviously discuss the pains of imprisonment, the emotional stresses and traumas that people experience while being incarcerated, but the prison does not exist in isolation. Our findings show that participants often already have extensive histories of contact with a variety of governmental and often carceral institutions before coming into contact with the formal criminal justice system in general or prisons in particular. And these prior contacts or experiences play a profound role in how people view prison and how they compare the prison to other institutions that we may not typically consider when thinking about the justice system. So in short, people's prior experiences ultimately play a role in why they sometimes might make a decision to turn themselves in, like with Maurice. And as Maurice reminded us, why the fuck would I trust social workers more than COs? They are the ones who shipped me from group home to group home. So moving forward in this work that many of us do, if we're not doing it already, is seriously considering the role of institutions outside of the criminal justice system and how these institutions contribute to keeping people stuck in that criminal justice system. And Maurice's statement, it seems, throws some curveballs as we try to develop a more humane justice system, because many ideas around alternatives to incarceration involve social workers and systems we deem less carceral and punitive, but may be perceived differently by people with certain lived experiences, at least when it comes to our Indigenous participants. So to wrap up, I'm nearing the end here. The last thing I want to talk about just quickly is kind of how we're moving forward with this project and our healing center that we're planning on developing. So what are the next few years going to look like? I'm just going to take a sip of water. My voice is running out. And so what you see on the slides is how we anticipate structuring this initiative, which is tentatively called the Edmonton Healing and Integration Center. And what you see here, it's a bit of a mess visually, but it visualizes the structure and staffing of the proposed center, where we would have in-house cultural supports through Elder Russell Auger and Travis Enright. And so how does the center help people? In a nutshell, if you're recently released from prison and you have no idea how to get a job or find or use transportation, or you're looking to connect with your family, or you're looking for cultural or spiritual resources, we try to help you find those things. So obviously, we don't have the power or money to provide things like housing or transportation at the center itself, but we would have caseworkers who essentially sit down with the client and help that person develop a reentry plan. Ask that person, how do you define successful reentry? What do you need? How can we help you get started? and we can direct them to various resources to the best of our ability. And of course, we have Elder Russell and Travis Enright who have agreed to provide in-house cultural resources. So that's one thing we can provide on site at some level. And maybe we could host sessions like how to write a resume or small events like that and get our students involved is what I would ideally imagine. Just another look at the structure we've proposed. We also want to work in an evaluation study into the center. So what does that mean? In other words, as we take on clients, they will also evaluate our service if they consent to it, of course. And we want to document their experience seeking resources through the center and elsewhere. And this will help us understand not just how to improve our reentry services, but also tell us about who our clients are and what their needs are, what has been working for them, what hasn't, and this information we can use to create or inform better supports. And so to wrap up, for this initiative, we're connected with Bent Arrow, the United Way. We've had expressed interest and enthusiasm from Métis Nation of Alberta, Native Counseling Services, National Indigenous Justice Strategy, Boyle Street, among other local organizations. And so the final question, of course, is how do we fund this? And why I'm ending with this question is to draw attention to the fact that support for people released from prison is not institutionalized or official. What I mean by that is that Canada or Alberta does not have, for example, a centralized like Ministry of Reentry or something like that. There is no official or robust institution that supports people reintegrating into communities. Instead, this very important work falls onto these kind of more local organizations and community-based programs. And so basically you have this situation where various groups and sometimes indigenous nations are competing for often temporary short-term grants where you have this patchwork system of programs coming and going, which is altogether insufficient, in my opinion, for building long-term sustainable support systems. Um, Obviously, what people are working on and what exists out there, that's not to disparage anything that they're doing, but trying to, have a bigger sustainable system is not possible with the current way things are. There are few resources robust enough to support these people being released from prison every day. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in with our project, and we're working to try and fund this in various ways as we speak. We've been trying to fund this for over a year now. But to end on a positive note, we are nonetheless confident that we can make this possible in the next few years. It's just a matter of time. We have a great team of grad students and our community partners, Elder Russell, Elder Bonnie Spencer, Travis Enright. They're fantastic. So we're hopeful about developing this initiative and supporting people reentering their community. Um, so altogether, I just want to thank everyone for being here and listening, and thank you to the Rupert's Land Center for hosting me today and listening to our project. And I hope there was something insightful here for you. And of course, I welcome any questions or comments you might have. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Justin, for this really interesting presentation. So we will turn towards questions. I'd like to remind people, like during presentations, that you need to turn off your video for the next presentation. So Amanda, how are we doing those questions? Like just taking, yeah, I see, Bonita, I see your hand, but I'm just asking if
Yeah, well, I think that that's such a small group here. There's only
yeah,
22
okay,
of us, right? And I think that, yeah, raising hands and
okay,
unmuting to have a conversation would actually work really nice with this group.
okay.
Thank you, Justin. That was an amazing
Very.
presentation.
Thanks so much.
So, Bonita, if you want to ask your question.
Oh, I think you're muted.
I can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Oh, yes, there we go. Okay. Justin, thank you very much for your presentation. I have numerous questions. Do I have permission to ask all of them?
Oh, yeah, my permission for sure. I don't.
Well, it depends. Like if it's for the next hour, maybe it's
No. No. I appreciate your good work in this study. So just bear with me. Some of this may be just really raw questions. I haven't formulated them or softened any of them. I'm just as you were rolling, I was just doing my iterative writing. Um, so my first one is um, I want to know how your participants feel about being asked about their experiences. Like, what do you tell them about this work and how you're going to use this information and how it will benefit them?
I'm just writing them down.
Yeah, I will just ask I'll just
Oh yeah,
proceed with my questions, okay?
sure. Yeah, I'll write them down and then I can respond to each one. That
Thank you.
works.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in having access to the Library of Publications through Rupert's Land Center. And so if there's a way, Natalie, if I can, I'm a lifelong learner and I'm interested in reading further publications by the scholars. Has any of this information or any of your findings been adopted by public agencies or academia to address any of the calls to action or your findings? Because some of your findings, I think, are quite extreme, and you must have a sense of urgency about something that needs to be done with them. Um, is there any new legislation? I have a public policy background. Is there any new legislation approved to address some of these issues that you've addressed here that we're aware of? Or is there new legislation or new policies in place that are going to try and address some of this? What actions have been executed to reduce that 60%? That 60% has been hovering like a wave in the air for many, many years. And so I'm interested in knowing what actions have been executed to reduce that incarceration rate of Indigenous people. Here's something that I'm seeing a word that's missing throughout the presentation and is very important to me. Where does education land as a factor in the recidivism? Does the institution, do the prisons provide education and training? Is that is there a requirement that um, uh, those in the prison system are required to complete an education program of some type, education or training? Do the researchers on this project create a relationship with the participants? I think if you have, I'm thinking that you do. I just would I'm interested in knowing that
Sure.
relationship factor. Um, as we are aware in the Indigenous community, it's about relationships. So when we're asking some very personal questions,
Mhm.
I'm, I'm thinking that relationships are created in that. Um, and so thank you for also bringing, enlightening me about this subject matter and the system produced recidivism. Um, and so I hope you don't take offense to any of my
Yeah.
questions, but I'm genuinely interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you, Justin.
No, thanks so much for that, Bonita. I think I can answer most of these. So I guess the first, I kind of go through them. The first one you said, how do participants feel when they're asked about their experiences? I guess you should preface this by saying, everything is voluntary, of course. They do have the option to refuse, and that does happen, right? They're like, I don't want
Mhm.
to talk about my kids or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So we definitely try to be aware of people's, sensitive areas that they maybe don't want to talk about.
Right.
But we found the folks that we talked to quite candid about what they want to share. And I guess like to contextualize this, when we do this work, we talk to people and I think all the time, at least from my experience interviewing, people will say like, no one's ever asked me what I thought about this place before. Or no one's
Mhm.
ever asked me what I need when I leave. No one's ever, even with the release stuff, no one's ever, no, I've been in the prison for a year now. No one's ever asked me what my release plan is, even though I'm leaving today. So I think there's what's the word? I think there's a want to talk about their experiences. And if it gets too sensitive, we move on to the next thing because we're obviously, aware and we want to keep that trauma-informed approach, not to kindle any bad memories and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So yeah, we I think are very aware that to try and avoid sensitive issues if we notice that it's affecting the participant, and to inform them that they can skip at any time and the interview at any time. So I think we've had also reflected in the recruitment and participation amount of people participating, pretty positive responses to just the project existing and people sharing with each other. I mean, not lots, but many of these people in the prison like know each other and they'll share like their experiences with our project. We've been doing this for 9 years now. So people
Mhm.
kind of know a little bit who we are
Mm.
sometimes in advance, or they've heard from other people on their unit. Um, and as far as we can tell, it's been quite positive. And of course, we do compensate people for their time, which is an important thing to know. So we do pay people for their time.
Oh,
Uh,
that's good. Good to
yeah.
know. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, we do pay people for their time. Every interview, we pay them money so that because these interviews can be anywhere from like an hour to 2 hours, depending on the person. So we do want to compensate them for the
Mm.
publications. You mentioned the publications. We do have a website, I think. Yeah, the Center for Criminology website, UAPP, University of Alberta Prison Project website. All of our stuff is there, so you should be able to find it. I think pretty easy. A lot of it is open access or just available without having to go through the journal uh, barring you from accessing.
And what about Rupert's Land Center
Oh,
generally?
I can't
Generally.
speak to the Rupert's Land
Yeah, we
stuff.
do have like you just have to go to our website and you'll see that
Okay.
we have some publications and you just
Okay.
and all of them are accessible.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And kind of
So
moving.
do
Oh,
you also, Justin, do you also tell them how this information is going to be used?
yeah. So this is kind of like I think it was kind of related to one of your other questions. So we tell them right off the bat when we start our interview. Here's what we kind of broadly want to know, just about your experiences. Talk about maybe your family, substance use, that kind of thing. You can skip anything you want. And ideally, what we want to do is use the findings to inform uh, reentry supports. Uh, and we do tell people like we can't provide these to you right now, and they're aware of that. So basically, they're doing the interview, and my impression of the interview is like they want to share their story, and we've had people literally say like, yeah, this probably isn't going to help me, but I hope it will help other people in the future who are going through similar experiences as.
Mhm.
You also had a question about the findings. Have the findings been adopted by anybody? So we have like this study is still new. We do
Mhm.
think because this is like government kind of brain where it's like the government won't listen unless you have like a big, huge study, where there's pressure for people to listen. For our original study, I mean, this gets into the nitty-gritty a little bit, but like that was like a qualitative study where it was more open-ended and exploratory. Uh,
Mhm.
we had some statistics on victimization, which was used to, for example, introduce a victim services center in one of the remand centers based on our data and probably other data as well. So it has been used here and there, the original study, but this new study isn't done yet. So the short answer is no, in the sense of people using this information, because, yeah, I mean, because we're still working on the study.
Well, I'm just thinking of lawyers that particularly represent clients that are Indigenous, and some
Mhm.
of your data is you know at the forefront, and it's new, and some of this information can help perhaps these particular lawyers, and we know who they are. I mean, nothing says that they represent indigenous peoples, but we're familiar with those who are familiar with the system know who they are. But I think
Right.
that your good work and your qualitative and quantitative data may really might be helpful to some of these lawyers representing them.
Oh yeah, especially when we have that finalized data set and we can
But
also.
even now,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ideally, I would love everyone to listen and start doing policy. It's just, yeah, there's that kind of threshold, at least among government people, that okay, would policy has to wait till like bigger numbers, and we will be there. But yeah, it can be used in like maybe smaller scale cases to compare experiences.
please consider lawyers that are representing Indigenous peoples.
I appreciate that.
They need as much data that they can get, especially at the forefront, and being aware that this study is in play. I think that's important, perhaps considering doing a presentation to, to the Indigenous representatives. I'm very impressed that this is being done. You just need to put on your salesman hat there a little bit
Yeah.
and share some of that. And even though it is in progress, I think it may give them some, confidence that somebody is actually
Hmm.
coming eventually to support them with something at the end, or even they can maybe even give you some further insights from a different perspective.
Yeah.
That's just my thought.
You-
Sorry, I know you're trying to answer all my
Thank you,
questions.
Juanita, but I think I'd like to maybe turn towards other people who have
Yes,
questions, if
yes.
it's okay with you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Oh, education. I'm sorry. Education was not answered.
okay, but
Oh,
that's the last question for you.
Thank you,
oh yeah,
Nevin.
just quickly on education. So this comes down to prison programming in a nutshell. I don't study education, so I can't speak to this too broadly, but like I have my few papers arguing stuff related to indigenized programs. So basically there are in some prisons like elder programs and certain courses that teach colonial history. And there's a fight right now. I mean, forever there's been a fight to get them more indigenous led and get community more involved in these programs and that sort of thing. So when it comes to education, those things exist, but they're incredibly sparse. If you're talking about like grade school education, those exist as well. People can get their GED in I don't want to speak too concretely about this because I don't want to say something that's not true. But I think in most prisons you can get your GED if you apply and you're on good behavior and that sort of thing. So we've talked to lots of people who are doing education stuff in the prison. If you're talking about post-secondary, I can't speak to that. But anyway, my publications, I talk a little bit about the indigenized programming and indigenized education that talks about colonial history and helps people think about how their histories, personal and community histories, have been impacted by Canada's policies. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
No, sorry.
I'm going to turn to Mohammed. If you want to ask your questions, turn on your, or either turn on just your video and microphone, or if you don't want to do that, then you have questions in the chat.
I can also just read and respond.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, so he asked, so he said, I worked at EIFW Max for a number of years and found that the institution does not hire most appropriate people to be elders. Most of them were more dangerous than helpful. And I guess, so I'll speak to that because the second part seems separate. Yeah, this is a big concern. Our participants, at least from our original study, found elders incredibly helpful. However, this is kind of alluding to my earlier point that it needs to be Indigenous led and controlled rather than controlled by the Canadian prison system. And there's efforts to do that. And so I would say that that is a consequence of not having enough Indigenous control over something like an elder visit program. I actually don't even think they use the word elder anymore because frankly we can't find enough like community elders to go into these spaces, and also they're busy with the other things in their own communities, and so they use a different, I should know the phrase offhand, but I'm not sure what they're calling prison elders now, but I don't think they actually use the phrase elder anymore. So yes, I agree that it's an issue. A great elder can do amazing things for people in prison, but then that's why we need as much Indigenous control over these initiatives as possible. And you asked, did you consider interviewing any parole board members? The short answer is no. Parole board members. I mean, we our study right now just focuses on system involved people, so people who are being processed or incarcerated, that kind of thing. We haven't really done much on practitioners yet, which would be those kinds of groups. That can be something we look at in the future, and obviously that's an important group and would be interesting to talk to them about this sort of thing, but the short answer is no. That's something we can do in the future maybe. And
So those
anyway,
were
thanks for the question.
the questions from Carolyn Wagner, but Mohammed had questions also a little bit earlier.
Oh, sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't see that. But do you think only support decrease government policies? How do political economy issues? I guess I can kind of respond to this which was also, I think, Bonita asked a question like this as well, is like, what are we doing to reduce the overrepresented or like mass incarceration issue? And there's no, I don't want to, like, there's no simple answer to this, unfortunately. I mean, my kind of broad response would be to give Indigenous nations and organizations more control or just control over the justice process and healing process. I mean, we call that rehabilitation, right? Healing, rehabilitation. This is what's kind of happening with healing lodges. Some of you may have heard of healing lodges, which are, depending on the lodge, run by Indigenous communities or nations. Some are run by the government. And what we're trying to, not we, like Indigenous peoples are trying to do is get more control of the incarceration and justice process. So indigenizing justice is the long and short of like, how do we respond to this problem of mass incarceration? Well, we need to take a power away, I think, from the state and let Indigenous peoples have control over their justice processes. That's kind of vague, and if I had more time, I can get into it in more detail, talk about Indigenous courts, more on healing lodges, but I'm kind of running out of time, but I'll leave it at that. But I appreciate the question.
Another topic that, maybe
Yeah,
for
yeah.
another time. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any other people who have a question. If not, well, I'd like to thank you again, Justin, for this excellent presentation and for
Thanks,
sharing
everybody.
your research with the research group. We really appreciate it. And so now I'm going to turn to Sharon Bork. So I'll present Sharon. Sharon Bork is a citizen of the Métis Nation within Alberta, represented by the Otipemisiwak Métis government, and currently works as its Director of Justice. She's passionate about serving the community and believes in the power of relationship building and bringing people together to create change. Sharon is a retired police officer and teacher and brings a wealth of experience to her roles. She has sat on numerous boards and committees over the years. Sharon has a Master of Education, and she's also an alumni from the Faculty of Native Studies here at the University of Alberta, as well as she has a Bachelor of Arts in Native Studies and a Bachelor of Education. She's married to Mike and has a daughter, Kendra, who is in her 4th year of policing with Edmonton Police Service. So the presentation, it's not exactly a presentation, it's a documentary called Finding Justice, Métis Families' Experiences with the Criminal Justice System. So Sharon will present the documentary to us, and then we'll watch it, and then afterwards we'll have a discussion or questions. So I remind people, please turn your video off and your mic off. Thank you so much. So Sharon, if you want to.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda and Natalie, for the invitation to be a part of today's Métis Talks. I'm going to be sharing with you this documentary, Finding Justice, Métis Families' Experiences with the Criminal Justice System.